If you were to stand at the gates of Halberstadt Palace in the spring of 1723, you might think you'd arrived at the center of the world's beauty. White limestone walls shimmered under the morning sun, flanked by fountains so high their mist hung like pearls in the air. Gardens rolled out in geometric perfection, hedges clipped so precisely they looked as though they'd been carved from emerald. Carriages of polished walnut and gold trim lined the grand approach, their wheels whispering over crushed seashell gravel. And then, the music. Strings and flutes drifting from an open loggia, the sound so pure it seemed to rise out of the marble itself. Courtiers moved through the scene in silks and velvets that caught the light like ripples of water, their powdered wigs immaculate, their faces dusted with the faint blush of rose powder. From a distance, it was paradise wrapped in stone and ceremony, a place so steeped in wealth and refinement that even the air seemed richer here. But the closer you came, the less the illusion held. What looked like crystal water in the fountains carried a faint brown cloud in its base, a slow churn of algae and silt that no servant seemed eager to clear. The sweet smell of the flower beds was laced with something else, a sour animal musk that clung in the stillness between gusts of wind. And if you waited for one of the grand oak doors to swing open, you'd see it. A courtier stepping out into the sunlight, leaning casually against the stone to spit a dark, stringy clot into the gravel before resuming his stroll, as if nothing had happened. From the outside, Halberstadt Palace was the distilled image of order and control. Every leaf, every column, every beam of sunlight seemed to obey a divine symmetry. But step inside, and the symmetry fractured. The mirrored galleries that reflected an endless blaze of chandeliers also reflected the shadows in their corners. Shadows that moved when no one passed, shadows shaped like things that had no place in a palace. The marble floors were warm underfoot, not because of the spring sun, but because the building's foundations rested over a network of enclosed drains that clogged so often, the rot from below seemed to breathe through the stone. Foreign dignitaries on their first visit often found themselves frozen mid-step. They had expected the fragrance of imported citrus and beeswax candles. Instead, their nostrils flinched at the faint but inescapable undercurrent of mildew, meat, and the sharp tang of vinegar used to mask worse things. The courtiers pretended not to notice. They would smile, bow, and let the music fill the silence before a guest dared to speak of the smell. And if the guest asked too many questions, they would be taken outside, steered back into the sunlight where the golden facades could work their magic again. The illusion was deliberate. From its conception, the palace was built to overwhelm the eye and silence the mind. The central courtyard was designed so that anyone standing at its heart could see the sky framed by perfect architectural angles, but not the kitchen wings or the refuse pits hidden just beyond. The ceremonial halls were aligned so that sunlight struck the thrones at just the right hour of the day, igniting the gold leaf and throwing it into brilliance, but the same light also illuminated the faint water stains creeping down from the ceilings. Those stains had been painted over so many times they seemed to have their own texture, a layered history of failure written into the walls. At night, the palace transformed again. From the hills beyond, it glowed like a lantern, hundreds of candles lighting the windows in steady rows. But inside, the wax smoke clung in thick ribbons that made eyes water and throats scratch. Servants moved quickly through the haze, heads down, their aprons dusted with powder from the wigs they had dressed hours before. The music was louder then, not just to entertain, but to drown out other sounds. The scrape of rats behind the paneling, the thud of something heavy dropped where it shouldn't be, the short, muffled cry that no one turned to acknowledge. The king himself, when he appeared, seemed carved from the same marble as the statues that lined the gardens. His face was smooth, his eyes unreadable, his clothing a monument to excess, silver-threaded brocade, buttons carved from mother-of-pearl, and cuffs stiff with lace. He walked with the pace of a man who believed time itself waited for him to arrive. And yet, those who walked behind him often noticed how the hem of his coat brushed against the floor, picking up fine gray dust from the flagstones. Where the dust came from was a question never asked. Visitors left with stories. Some told only of the grandeur, the chandeliers like constellations, the scent of orange blossoms in the banquet hall, the endless walls of mirrors. Others told quieter stories, the kind that passed in whispers between merchants in distant cities, that the beauty was skin-deep, that something behind those walls watched the guests as much as the guests admired the palace. There were tales of rooms locked not for security, but because their contents could not bear daylight. And once a merchant's clerk swore he saw water dripping from a statue's mouth as if the marble itself had begun to weep. The palace was a contradiction made stone, the pinnacle of refinement built over something far less refined. It dazzled and it deceived in equal measure. To the common citizen peering through its gates, it was a dream given form. But for those who walked its halls long enough, the dream began to rot at the edges, revealing what it had always been: a mask, carefully painted, hiding a face no one dared to look at for too long. And like all masks worn too long, it had begun to crack. The first sign that Halberstadt Palace was not what it claimed to be came in the form of a dinner invitation, one extended not for an evening feast, but for a midday digestive audience with the king. Guests arrived expecting a light meal, perhaps some delicate pastries and spiced wine, served while the monarch dispensed polite conversation. Instead, they were shown into a small, gilded chamber at the far end of the east wing, where the air was heavy with a smell no amount of perfume could conquer. There, seated on a chair of carved walnut and crimson velvet, the king greeted them warmly, while relieving himself into a wide porcelain bowl positioned directly beneath him. It was not a matter of accident or private urgency. This was a tradition. King Wilhelm IV, sovereign of Halberstadt, and self-proclaimed heir to the purest court in Europe, conducted state matters from what he called his throne of necessity. A brass-bound table stood beside him, stacked with letters sealed in wax, dispatches from distant provinces, and crystal goblets filled with amber cordial. Between signing orders and hearing petitions, the king would sip, speak, and then, with no pause in conversation, lean slightly forward to allow a servant to discreetly swap out the full porcelain bowl for an empty one. The practice was so routine that courtiers had developed a system for measuring its efficiency. The royal steward, ever precise, kept a ledger noting the intervals of replenishment, the time it took for the king to fill a bowl, as if it were a matter of military readiness. In the year 1721, the record stood at 13 bowls in a single sitting, a statistic whispered with pride by those close to the crown. Visitors, of course, were less impressed. One ambassador from Milan, unable to contain his disgust, claimed he could taste the odor clinging to the rim of his wine glass hours after the audience had ended. The royal explanation for this bizarre custom was equally absurd. "A ruler's duty is constant," Wilhelm reportedly said, "and the body's needs are no excuse for abandoning one's post." But those who served him knew the truth ran deeper, or more precisely, fouler. The palace's so-called private retiring rooms, intended for personal relief, were so ill-maintained that even the monarch refused to use them. Pipes clogged for weeks at a time, drains burped up black water, and the stench of the underground pits would curl up into the hallways like a living thing. The king's audience chamber, by contrast, was meticulously kept. Servants scrubbed the tiles each morning with lye, and a permanent brazier burned crushed rosemary and sage in an attempt to purify the air. The porcelain bowls themselves were imported from Delft, painted with blue pastoral scenes that looked almost comical in the circumstances. But none of it could fully disguise the truth. Every conversation in that room was underscored by the faint, wet sound of liquid meeting ceramic. Word of the seated audiences spread beyond the palace walls, not as official gossip, but as something half-believed, too strange to be entirely dismissed. The merchant families who supplied the court began declining personal audiences, preferring to send their sons or clerks. Foreign dignitaries rehearsed their speeches in advance, determined to finish them before the next bowl change. Yet, as grotesque as it seemed, the custom persisted for years, unchallenged, woven into the daily rhythm of power. And this was only the beginning. For if the king himself had adapted to such a grotesque compromise, it begged the question: what else had the people of Halberstadt Palace learned to accept? The answer lay just beyond the chamber doors, in corridors where beauty and decay shared the same air, and where the rules of civility were bent until they no longer resembled rules at all. At Halberstadt Palace, the day began before dawn, not with the quiet dignity of a royal residence waking to life, but with the clatter of buckets and the groan of wooden carts hauling the night's refuse toward the courtyards. In the dim light, servants moved like shadows, each carrying some part of the palace's filth: chamber pots sloshing with sour contents, heaps of soiled straw from the stables, baskets of fish heads and meat bones crawling with the first flies of morning. The air was sharp and wet, laced with the bite of ammonia where urine had been left to dry overnight, mingling with the coppery tang of fresh blood from the kitchen's early slaughter. By the time the first golden sunlight touched the limestone walls, the palace had already begun to reek in its own peculiar way: perfume and rot, bread baking in ovens just downwind of the cesspools, damp wool cloaks hung to dry over smoky braziers. In the grand hallways, the marble underfoot felt cool, but never clean. The stone was porous, and years of spills, wine, ink, soup, worse, had seeped deep into it, leaving faint, dark halos that no scrubbing could erase. Walking there in soft leather shoes meant feeling a faint, gritty residue clinging to the soles. The courtiers emerged late, wrapped in silks that whispered when they moved, their faces a careful mask of powder and rouge. They greeted one another with bows and gloved handshakes, pretending not to notice the brown streaks dried along the base of the stone columns, or the fact that the scent of lavender oil clinging to a duchess's gown was doing a poor job of covering the smell of last night's wine, still souring on her breath. They would stroll through the galleries as if the faint scratching in the walls, the steady gnawing of rats, were nothing more than the sound of the building settling. In the kitchens, the atmosphere was worse. They were buried deep in the palace, where light came only from oil lamps and the air was so thick with smoke that even the walls had taken on a greasy sheen. Meat hung from hooks in various stages of preparation, plucked fowl with skin like wax paper, slabs of beef crawling with fat-bodied flies that servants lazily shooed away with sprigs of rosemary. A pot of stew simmered on the hearth, the surface dotted with islands of yellow fat, while beside it a young scullion gutted eels over a pail, his bare hands slick and cold, the water tinged red. Occasionally, a trickle of brown water would snake across the flagstones from the corner where the drains backed up. No one stopped to mop it. The servants' quarters were no refuge. Narrow wooden bunks were stacked so close you could smell the oil in your neighbor's hair. The air was damp and warm from too many bodies breathing in too small a space, and the straw in the mattresses was alive with the faint, dry rustle of fleas. A basin in the corner held water that had already turned cloudy after 3 washes. By nightfall, the surface would be slick with an iridescent film. Yet here, laughter was common. The servants swapped stories, shared stolen bites of the palace's food, and played cards by candlelight, as if the closeness and grime were nothing to remark on. Even the public rooms, meant to impress, carried their own layers of decay. The Hall of Maps, where diplomats admired vast paintings of distant lands, was also home to a mildew bloom creeping in the corners, faintly green in the right light. In the chapel of St. Remiel, the sweet scent of incense drifted over pews polished by centuries of worshippers, but if you knelt too close to the altar rail, you could smell the faint, unmistakable odor of mice nesting in the woodwork. By afternoon, the palace hummed with the rituals of its strange normalcy. A viscount might pause mid-conversation to pluck a louse from his wig, flicking it to the floor without breaking eye contact. A maid would sweep the gallery, pausing to tilt her head as something scurried across the far end, before returning to her work as though she had seen nothing. Outside, the gardens appeared pristine, but walk past the hedges and you would find the mulch steaming faintly, a disguise for the chamber pot contents dumped there at dawn. By evening, candle smoke hung in the air like a gauze veil. The music played louder to keep the court from hearing the muffled coughs of the king's physicians down the corridor, or the splash of another bucket being emptied somewhere unseen. The courtiers lingered in clusters, wine-stained lips smiling, gloved hands gesturing in games of wit and rumor, as if the palace itself were not quietly rotting around them. It was a world that thrived not in spite of the shadows, but because they were everywhere. Shadows that swallowed the ugliness, so beauty could pretend to be all there was. Behind the gilt-paneled doors of Halberstadt Palace, far from the marbled corridors where courtiers paraded their virtue, the rules of propriety dissolved like ink in water. The most immaculate rooms, the ones open to visiting dignitaries, were only the front stage of a much larger performance. Beyond them lay a maze of chambers and stairwells where the air was warmer, the shadows thicker, and the truth of the court's habits impossible to ignore. The king's private apartments were the epicenter of this double life. To the public, they were sanctuaries of discipline, libraries lined with leather-bound tomes, writing desks covered in maps and decrees, a bed draped in cloth of gold. But by night, the same rooms became venues for indulgence that would never appear in any official chronicle. The library, with its solemn portraits and heavy curtains, doubled as a gambling hall after dusk. Candles were snuffed low to hide the piles of coin-changing hands, and the portraits of dead monarchs stared down through the gloom at dice tumbling over maps of provinces that were losing grain to the king's unpaid debts. The king's council chamber was no less compromised. It was here that decrees about moral order were signed, proclamations condemning public vice, outlawing unseemly gatherings, and promoting virtue among the common people. And yet, those very tables had been used hours earlier to host quiet suppers for the monarch's favorites. Actresses, widows with estates worth swallowing, foreign envoys willing to trade their loyalty for a night in the king's favor. The court called these policy dinners, though nothing discussed at them ever reached the formal record. Not all hypocrisy belonged to the king. The ministers, those rigid-faced men in embroidered coats, were just as practiced in the art of concealment. One was known for his fiery sermons on the sanctity of marriage, delivered in the palace chapel with trembling conviction. But only a handful of people knew that a hidden stairwell from his office led to a small attic chamber where a young woman lived year-round, her rent and food paid for in gold from the Treasury's miscellaneous expenses ledger. Another, a military advisor famous for his hard stance on discipline, kept a locked cabinet filled with foreign wines, smuggled silks, and letters written in a cipher only he and his mistress understood. Perhaps the most disturbing of the palace's hidden customs were the quiet processions. These took place late at night, when a handful of servants, sworn to silence, would carry covered stretchers through the servants' corridors and down into the subcellars. No one spoke of who lay beneath the linen sheets or why they never reappeared. The official explanation, if pressed, was that the palace maintained a medical ward for the comfort of its household. Yet no one outside those corridors had ever seen it. The spaces where these contradictions unfolded were carefully insulated from the public eye. Narrow back stairs connected grand chambers to cramped antechambers lined with hooks for masks and cloaks. Behind the music room, where guests heard only harpsichords and violins, there was a locked door leading to a low, windowless salon where courtiers drank until their wigs slid sideways, betting on which footman could stand longest with a candle balanced on his head. One floor above, in a gallery hung with tapestries of saints and martyrs, there was a hidden latch that opened onto a balcony overlooking the gardens, a place favored by certain ministers for whispered negotiations that often concluded with the exchange of something far more tangible than promises. These were the true arteries of the palace, pulsing with deals, betrayals, and indulgences, all carefully hidden from the bright chambers where the king received his court. It was an unspoken pact. In public, everyone wore the mask. In private, the masks were hung on hooks and the air grew thick with the smell of wine, sweat, and secrets too dangerous to survive daylight. And every morning, when the bells called the court back to its daily theater of perfection, the same doors were shut, the same latches drawn, and the truth was sealed away. Until night came again. The grandeur of Halberstadt Palace came at a cost no tailor's thread or perfumer's oil could disguise. It was written in the bodies of those who lived there, the stooped shoulders, the pocked skin, the yellowed eyes of courtiers who smiled through pain for the sake of appearances. The building itself seemed to leach sickness into its residents. Damp stone walls sweated through the winters, feeding a permanent bloom of mold in the upper corners of rooms, and anyone who slept beneath them awoke with a throat raw from breathing spores. Servants coughed for months at a time, their hacking echoing faintly through the night corridors, but no one dared call it illness in the official records. The drinking water was filtered through sandpits dug decades earlier and never cleaned. Even in its clearest state, it carried a faint, metallic tang, and on certain mornings when the light hit the cups just so, tiny threads of sediment curled lazily at the bottom. Stomach cramps were as common as idle gossip, and the palace physicians, unable to stop them, prescribed purges that left their patients weaker than before. In the warmer months, flies swarmed the kitchens, laying their eggs in uncovered cream or strips of meat. More than one banquet ended in half the guests vanishing discreetly to their chambers before the final course. Teeth suffered most visibly. Sugar had become a fashionable vice among the upper court. Candied violets, glazed fruits, and almond pastes brought in from the south. But brushing was an afterthought, and the powders sold for polishing teeth often ground away the enamel entirely. Smiles at Halberstadt were tight-lipped affairs, designed to hide blackened molars or the sudden gaps left by extractions. In the king's own mouth, 4 teeth remained, each worn to a jagged edge, and his breath was so sour that attendants learned to stand half a pace behind him during audiences. Lice were constant companions. The wigs meant to hide thinning hair also served as a warm refuge for the insects, and while the wealthiest could afford to have theirs boiled monthly, most simply dusted them with perfumed powder and hoped for the best. Scratching was so common that it became a kind of absent-minded courtly gesture, performed with the same elegance as a bow or a flutter of a fan. Beneath the wigs, the scalp was often raw and tender, small scabs hidden beneath layers of starch and powder. The physicians themselves were as much a hazard as a help. Bleeding remained the preferred cure for nearly every complaint, from fainting to fevers. After a particularly long winter, it was whispered that the chief physician had drained so much blood from the court's ladies that 2 collapsed during a single evening of dancing. Leeches were kept in shallow ceramic bowls in the apothecary rooms, their slick bodies writhing lazily in cloudy water until summoned to latch onto a patient's skin. Parasites thrived here. The kitchens, without running water, could never fully rid their stores of them, and raw vegetables were served with soil still clinging to the roots. Tapeworms were an open secret. Long, pale ribbons passed in private and burned quickly in the scullery fire before anyone could measure them. The king himself suffered from them more than once, and it was said that on one occasion a servant fainted when a worm nearly the length of her forearm was lifted from the royal chamber pot. Skin ailments, too, were part of daily life. The thick cosmetics used to achieve the court's pale, flawless look often contained lead and mercury. Over time, these left the skin mottled, hands trembling, and memory dulled. In the mirrored halls, where every blemish was meant to be hidden under a flawless mask, the truth emerged only at night, when powder washed away to reveal sores at the hairline and rashes creeping up the neck. All of it was endured in silence, woven into the palace's peculiar rhythm. Pain was dressed in silk, sickness masked with rouge, and bodies crumbling from within moved with the grace of dancers. Because here, survival meant never letting anyone see the toll that beauty, and the place that claimed to embody it, truly demanded. At Halberstadt Palace, beauty was less a gift than an elaborate act of stagecraft, a daily performance meant to smother the scent of rot with the weight of silk and the shimmer of powdered light. Every morning, the court transformed itself in a ritual that began long before the first visitor stepped through the gates. Servants wheeled in screens, mirrors, and trunks of fabrics. They brought bowls of perfumed water, jars of paint-thick cosmetics, and vials of scent so potent they seemed to burn the air. What followed was not so much dressing as the construction of a disguise. Perfume was the first line of defense. The palace reeked of mildew, drains, unwashed bodies, so its residents waged war with fragrance. Men drenched themselves in bergamot and amber until the air around them became a hot, heady cloud. Ladies wore sachets of crushed lavender and dried orange peel tucked into their bodices, their heat releasing waves of sweetness that could not quite mask the sourness beneath. Hallways filled with competing scents until they became suffocating. To walk from one end of the gallery to the other was to pass through shifting weather fronts of rose, musk, and the unmistakable bitterness of civet, scraped from the glands of caged animals. Then came the paint. Faces were washed not with soap but with milk or wine, dabbed dry, then coated in a paste of white lead that gave the skin its ghostly pallor. This was powdered over and over, building a mask so thick that smiles left no creases. Onto this blank canvas went rouge made from crushed cochineal beetles, daubed high on the cheekbones in bright circles meant to suggest health where none existed. Lips were painted with vermilion, knowing full well the mercury inside it would leach into the blood. At a distance, the effect was luminous. Up close, the powder clung in fine cracks, and the rouge bled into the corners of the mouth like old wine stains. Hair was its own form of deception. Beneath the towering powdered wigs and elaborate braids, most heads were shaved bare to avoid lice, or to hide the scarring left by years of scratching. The wigs themselves were feats of architecture, wired into shapes that could add half a foot to the wearer's height, dusted white to symbolize purity while trapping the faint, warm scent of pomade and scalp. They were decorated with silk ribbons, glass beads, even small, artificial birds. A duchess once arrived at a banquet with her wig styled into the form of a sailing ship, complete with tiny sails, while her neck flushed red beneath the powder from the weight of it. The garments were no less strategic. Brocade and velvet concealed the swell of infected joints or the bandages covering sores. Stiff corsets forced the spine straight and hid the fact that half the court moved with the aches of chronic illness. Layer upon layer of fabric disguised the frailty of bodies that had been bled, purged, and poisoned by their own cosmetics. The king favored coats so heavily embroidered they were almost rigid, their metallic threads glinting under candlelight, a gleam to draw the eye away from the yellow tint in his gaze and the tremor in his hands. Even the palace itself joined in the cover-up. Gilded moldings drew attention upward, away from the warped floorboards. Mirrors multiplied the candlelight so shadows hid the stains creeping along the walls. Tapestries depicting heroic battles hung over patches of damp, their vibrant dyes distracting from the faint smell of mold beneath the wool. Ceremony completed the illusion. Processions through the Hall of Mirrors, balls in the great salon, afternoon promenades in the gardens, all carefully staged to keep movement flowing, to prevent guests from lingering too long in any one place where the truth might become too sharp to ignore. No one was allowed to stand still. Stillness invited scrutiny, and scrutiny risked breaking the spell. To an outsider, the court was dazzling, a constant blaze of color, scent, and motion. But for those who lived within it, the beauty was a shield, one they wore as much for survival as for vanity. Under the perfume and paint, under the wigs and brocade, the same truths lingered. The cough behind the fan, the louse beneath the powder, the bruise hidden in shadow. All the brilliance was nothing more than a curtain, and everyone at Halberstadt knew it, though no one dared to pull it aside. No matter how much gold leaf was laid over the walls or how many perfumes were poured into the air, Halberstadt Palace could not keep nature at bay. It pressed in from every crack in the limestone, every unsealed window frame, every unguarded corner. A relentless invasion that ignored rank and ritual alike. Rats were the most brazen of intruders, slipping in from the refuse pits and scurrying boldly along the baseboards of even the grandest chambers. They had learned the rhythm of the court, appearing in the banqueting hall after the final course was served, darting beneath the tables to claim dropped morsels before the servants could sweep them away. Some were so large that guests mistook them for cats until the tails gave them away. Cats did roam the palace, both pampered pets and wild mousers, their sleek bodies winding through the corridors at night. They kept the rats in check but left their own marks. Clawed upholstery, tufts of fur clinging to brocade drapes, and the sharp tang of their scent in warm corners. Courtiers pretended not to notice when a favored pet leapt onto a sideboard mid-meal to paw at a roast quail. The king himself tolerated their presence, claiming they were loyal subjects in the war against vermin, though their droppings were found just as often as the rats. Birds made their homes in the high places. Sparrows nested in the eaves, their droppings streaking the carved stonework just above the grand entrance. Pigeons gathered in the bell tower, cooing at dawn in a chorus that drowned out the chapel bells. Once, during a solemn mass, a startled rook tumbled from the rafters and flapped wildly across the nave, scattering feathers over the heads of the congregation before escaping through a broken pane of glass. The kitchen suffered most from the insect world. Cockroaches skittered across the flagstones at the scrape of a cupboard door, their shells gleaming in the lamplight. Moths bored into sacks of flour, leaving trails of powdery waste that cooks sifted away without comment. In the summer heat, clouds of flies rose from the drains and circled over platters of meat waiting to be carved. A palace cook once confided to a footman that she could tell the hour of the day by the sound of the flies. At midday, their droning was so loud it muffled the orders shouted across the room. Even the weather joined in the assault. Halberstadt's foundations rested on marshy ground, and after heavy rains the lower corridors filled with a shallow, oily water that seeped up through the flagstones. Servants waded through it in bare feet, skirts and breeches damp to the knee, carrying platters from the kitchens to the dining halls above. The smell was unmistakable, a sour mix of stagnant water, wet wool, and whatever had been festering in the drain since the last flood. On more than one occasion, a banquet had been delayed because the kitchens were ankle-deep in this brackish tide, pots and pans floating against the walls. In the warmer months, swarms of midges and mosquitoes poured in from the gardens. Courtiers swatted at them with fans, careful not to smear their cosmetics, while musicians played with sleeves pulled down to hide the welts on their arms. The insects were drawn to the candlelight during evening balls, diving into the flames with small popping sounds, their charred bodies collecting in the wax until the candles burned low and guttered out. The palace guards, stationed at the gates, were no less afflicted. Their boots, left too long in damp guardhouses, grew white blooms of fungus on the leather. Horses in the royal stables caught coughs from the drafts that swept through the stalls, their breath steaming in the winter air as grooms wrapped them in blankets that never quite dried. Even the royal gardens, so precise and symmetrical from afar, hid a constant battle against nature's return, weeds pushing up through the gravel paths, beetles chewing at the roots of ornamental hedges, and mushrooms sprouting in neat rows beneath the clipped boxwoods. For all its wealth and ceremony, Halberstadt Palace could never quite keep the outside world out. The animals, the insects, the creeping damp, they did not respect titles or treaties. They moved freely where they pleased, as if to remind the court that beneath the powder and brocade, they were just another species trying to survive in a place that was slowly, inevitably reclaiming itself. The decline of Halberstadt Palace did not come with the roar of rebellion or the crack of cannon fire. It began quietly, like the seep of water into stone, slow, constant, impossible to reverse. The king's health waned first, his once imposing frame reduced to a frail silhouette behind layers of brocade. His ministers aged with him, their painted faces stiffening into masks that could no longer hide the tremor of their hands or the cloudiness in their eyes. Guests arrived less often. Foreign dignitaries found excuses to meet elsewhere, citing the rigors of travel but whispering to their aides about the smell that seemed to cling to their clothing for days after a visit. Attempts at reform came too late. New pipes were laid to divert waste away from the foundations, but they cracked under the shifting marshland, releasing the same foulness into the soil. The kitchens were scrubbed and whitewashed, only for the plaster to peel within weeks, revealing the old, greasy stone beneath. Perfume stores were replenished at great expense, yet the scent of roses and amber only seemed to sharpen the staleness in the air. Even the gardens, once a showpiece of symmetry and control, lost their edges. The hedges grew ragged, weeds muscled through the gravel, and the fountains choked on algae until their waters stilled. As the court shrank, the palace's empty spaces became impossible to ignore. The grand halls echoed with footsteps that once blended into the murmur of hundreds of voices. Doors that had not been opened in years revealed rooms thick with dust and mouse droppings, their tapestries sagging like tired lungs. Servants moved through the corridors with less haste now, their eyes lowered, as if carrying a shared knowledge no one dared speak aloud. The palace was dying, and it would take them with it. When the king finally passed, in his bed, beneath canopies of embroidered silk that could not keep out the draft, the mourning was as much for the end of an era as for the man himself. Courtiers drifted away in the months that followed, some to other courts, others to modest country estates, each leaving behind a little more silence. The new ruler, a distant cousin with little taste for grandeur, visited only in summer, preferring his hunting lodge far from the stagnant air. And so Halberstadt Palace settled into a strange half-life. The gold still gleamed on its facades, but the windows stared blankly over gardens gone to seed. The rats and sparrows remained, as did the damp that rose through the stones each spring. The smell, faint, stubborn, and impossible to scrub away, lingered in every corner, clinging to wood, fabric, and memory. Visitors who came in later years described it with a shudder, not the sharp reek of fresh decay, but a ghost of it, a reminder of centuries when beauty was built over rot. In the end, the palace had outlived its court, its king, and even the truth it had worked so hard to conceal. And perhaps that was its final irony. All the powder, perfume, and ceremony had been meant to preserve the illusion of perfection. Yet what endured longest was not the glittering facade, it was the stench.